Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Per Capita webinar, one of our first in our new series where we are shifting temporarily onto online-only events, hoping to be back in hybrid events soon. My name's Emma Dawson. I'm the Executive Director here at Per Capita, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal people on the Kulin Nation here in Victoria. It's lovely to have you all with us. I'm sure wherever you are, you will join me in recognising the traditional owners of the land on which you are joining us from today. We all are on Aboriginal land, which was never ceded. I'm delighted today to welcome my friend Andrew Leigh here, one of our favourite guests in our Per Capita conversations, to talk about post-pandemic priorities for Australia. How do we rebuild a fairer society and a stronger economy? There are very few people in Parliament who think as deeply and as carefully about these issues as Andrew does, so we're delighted to have him here today. I'm going to let Andrew give you his thoughts on this. We'll then have a bit of a chat. If you do have any questions, please press them into the Q&A box. You can see the button at the bottom of your screen. We'll then be sure to make sure that as many of those questions we can get to as we possibly can. Please bear in mind that we are recording today's event. We will ensure that we ask questions on your behalf in a sensitive manner if that's required. And now, Andrew, over to you.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks to everyone who's joined the conversation today. I'm joining you from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I'd acknowledge elders past and present. Dara Nuna, Dara Ngunnawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawal Wari, Dara Wari, Dindi, Wangarlin Jinyin. I acknowledge any Indigenous people present on the call today. My theme for today's talk is the need for an ambitious Australia. And I was thinking about this when I was on a morning run and listening to a little snippet of a mashed up song for a techno piece, which is from the American show Animation Time. And the line just seemed to fit the current government so well. It is, you chew pancakes, but that's not eating. You move to music, but that's not dancing. And I feel like these guys are in government, but they're not governing. And that so much of what we're missing about the Australian government right now isn't the botched mistakes they're making, but the things they're not doing. I feel as though steadily over 8 years of coalition government, the Australian idea of what a great government can be has been eroded. We have, in that famous phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations, and the expectations of what an Australian government can do have been lowered. Of course, if Labor's elected next year, then we'll have a government that won't engage in sports rorts and car park rorts and land rorts. A government that'll take more care with Australian finances than a government which has spent billions of dollars of JobKeeper on firms with rising revenues. And a government which will be composed of people like Tanya Plibersek and Christina Keneally and Penny Wong in place of people like Christian Porter, Alan Tudge and Stuart Robert. But it's more than that. What we need to do, as the post-war governments in Australia of Curtin and Chifley did, is to say that after a crisis, we need to aim higher. And I wanted to flag here 5 things on which an Australian government could be far more ambitious. The first of those is education. Right through from early childhood to universities, there's work to be done. The hodgepodge of supports is familiar to any parent who's tried to negotiate preschool and early childhood. The way in which in some areas you've got a fully funded service, in other areas you're paying out of pocket and getting reimbursements. We can do better on early childhood. At the school level, we've got test scores that have been going backwards in year 9 according to the OECD's PISA tests, right for the last 20 years. On reading, on mathematics, on science, Australian students are now scoring about a year worse than their peers in the year 2000. So there's enormously important work to be done on attracting and retaining great teachers in Australian schools. In vocational training, we know about the collapse in apprenticeships, but then too, we've seen during COVID the problems in a government that doesn't respect the university sector and doesn't see an increased university attendance rate as being the best way of ensuring that we have a workforce set up for the automation that we know is coming. So there's a huge lot to be done in revamping Australian education and making sure that education is a key comparative advantage for Australia. Exporting education doesn't just mean we get a few more dollars. It also means we get to improve the system and make sure that we are the best in our region and competing with the best in the world. The second thing I want to talk about is startups. There's been a lot of chatter about startup policy over the last 8 years, but the raw figures show what's really going on. If you strip out non-employing businesses, that is, people who are forced to get an ABN because they've suddenly been outsourced, but they're fundamentally doing the same thing, and you just look at employing businesses, then it's pretty clear that the number of employing businesses created every year is lower now than it was at the turn of the century. Back then, we were producing about 8% more employing businesses every year. Now we're producing, back then we were producing 11%, now that's down to 8%. So the new business formation rate has fallen by about a third. One of the reasons for this, I think, is we're seeing increasing dominance in the Australian economy of a small number of large firms. Monopolisation has been a huge issue for the Biden administration. You can see that with appointments of people like Leigh to the FTC. And the importance of reining in monopolies is that it can also help to create an ecosystem in which new firms can flourish. Just like if you let the oaks get too big in the forest, the saplings can't spring up, so too in business formation, we need to do better in ensuring that we get an ecosystem with more startups. We also need to democratise the process of starting a business. Right now, 3/4 of startup founders are male, and startups are increasingly funded from the bank of mum and dad. Well, that's not good enough. As a Labor person, I am really passionate about making sure that we have startup opportunities for everyone, that new business formation is a mass participation sport, not an elite one. That's good for equity, but of course it's good for efficiency too, because it means that we get the very best out of Australian talent. We get to capture those lost Albert Einsteins, the lost Marie Curies, people who have the smarts to generate a new firm, but who need the opportunities that affluent kids are already getting. I also believe that we have a wonderful opportunity in renewables. For too long, those on to our left have characterised climate change as being a hair shirt issue on which Australia has to suffer to do the right thing. And those on the right say that we should just continue to party, throwing around lumps of coal in Parliament. But the fact is that there is a sensible middle way on climate change that recognises the opportunity of jobs in renewables. Just take coal-fired power stations, for example. We know that most were built in the 1960s and 1970s. They're reaching the end of their useful life. But we also know that there's a range of jobs associated with those power stations. So what better place to locate new renewables than where the current coal-fired power stations are? Because these aren't just generators, they're also places on which the electricity cables converge. So they're a natural physical location for new renewables plants. And of course, that provides fresh jobs for those who will lose theirs when coal-fired power stations close, as they inevitably will. Australian coal demand is determined largely by what's going on in the rest of the world. And the IEA has been very clear that their forecast for thermal coal sees it declining over the coming decades. We need to ensure that we're creating those jobs in solar and wind, taking advantage of things like offshore wind, as Chris Bowen has flagged, and ensuring that we're doing everything to capitalise on the opportunities of renewables. My fourth issue is that of work-life balance. Over the course of the last couple of decades, I think many of us have found ourselves just drowning in email. What the thinker Cal Newport describes as being part of the hyperactive hive mind, constant multitasking madness. That's meant that work has seeped into parts of our life that used to be separated from our employment obligations. It's meant, for example, that people are sleeping with their smartphones, feeling an obligation to respond to email at all hours, being constantly connected. That's not a particularly efficient way of running a business, and it's not good for people's mental health. We know about the impacts of social media on teens. Indeed, the Facebook leak recently has revealed that there was internal Facebook research showing that Instagram worsened body image issues for 1 out of 3 teen girls. But we also know that the slightly older technology of email has started to take away our capacity for deep work. Humans are at our happiest when we're experiencing a sense of flow, when we can lose ourselves in big, important tasks. Whether that's a craftsperson producing an extraordinary piece of furniture, whether it's an office worker operating at the limits of their abilities to produce a great report or to draft a letter that the company will send out. We need those periods of undistracted, uninterrupted focus, because that's what when we're at our best. So ensuring that we better restructure work to prevent email from taking over is going to be one of the important industrial challenges, and I believe one of the great sources of productivity growth. As you know, productivity growth has languished in the period since 2013. It used to be about 2% a year. In 2018-19, it actually went backwards. Australian workers produced less per hour than they had the previous year. So we need to turn productivity around, and I believe that a better use of email will be part of that. Firms which provide email carve-out times for staff, which use collaborations that don't require constant responses to email, will have more productive staff and happier staff too. And as part of that, I think we'll be able to look again at the question of working hours. It's been now about 40 years since the last big push on working hours. And Australia, as a country which has relatively few public holidays, could look reasonably at whether we want to encourage firms to expand the amount of annual leave. In many countries in Europe, 5 or 6 weeks of annual leave is the norm. At some point, I think Australia is going to have that conversation as a way of ensuring that we have a better work-life balance. And finally, trust. Nick Terrell and I wrote a book called Reconnected last year, which looked at the decline in civic life in Australia. Over the course of the last 50 years, we've seen a collapse in the share of Australians who are part of a union, who attend part of a religious community. We've seen a drop-off in the share of people playing an organised sport, and a decline in the proportion of Australians who are part of a community organisation. In politics, we can trace this from the decline in the share of people turning up to the ballot box and casting a valid vote, to the proportion of Australians who are members of a political party. Both on the measure of active civic engagement and on the measure of political joining, Australia is doing worse than we did in the past. Turning around that crisis in trust is work not just for government, but for all of us. We know that when you survey people and you say, would you like to live in a community where you know your neighbours? A vast majority say yes. But when you ask the question, how many of your neighbours' names do you know? People come back saying that they know relatively few of their neighbours' names. So it is important that we prioritise civic trust. Government can do some of this through raising the standing of parliamentarians. I think part of that will be a federal anti-corruption commission, making very clear that no longer should federal parliament be the only level of government at which we don't have an anti-corruption commission. And that might lead to some people losing their jobs. And I am totally relaxed about the prospect of somebody who is corrupt losing their jobs as a result of an anti-corruption commission. This is a feature, not a bug. We need to ensure that dodgy dealing in politics is not tolerated, that those who serve in public life recognise that this job is always a privilege, never a right, and that we have an obligation to build institutions and build trust with the broader community. That's an issue for both political parties, but it's especially an issue for parties on the left, parties like the Great Australian Labor Party that fundamentally believe that government has a powerful role in improving people's lives. If you're the side of politics that thinks that government needs to get out of the way, you're less likely to be concerned about political trust than if you're the side of government that built Medicare and the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So, Emma, there's 5 ideas that are occupying me at the moment, and I hope that they can spark something of a conversation for a more ambitious Australia. I know there's scads of areas in government policy that are important, which I haven't touched on today. Everything from our engagement with the region to improving the healthcare system. And I'm sure many of those who are part of the conversation will have their own ambitious ideas about what we can do there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew. And as always, 5 really meaty ideas for us to get our teeth into. You'll be unsurprised to know that I'm going to start with your work-life balance issue, because as you know, it's something I've long been pushing for us to think about how we can better manage our time and how we can maintain our productivity and our interest in work while giving us more of our time back to spend with our loved ones. You talk about the idea of, and you say, like I've said, it's 40 years since we last had a push on working hours in this country. Productivity of workers has gone up remarkably in that time, hasn't it? But we haven't seen the share of that productivity growth go to workers recently over the last 8 or 9 years in wage growth, but moreover in time back to those workers over the last 30 years. Why do you think that's happened?
Yes, great question, Emma. You think about John Maynard Keynes' 1931 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, where he makes 2 predictions. He predicts a 6-fold increase in productivity over the coming century, and he predicts that average working hours will fall to 15 hours a week, about 3 hours a day. We've already hit his productivity target ahead of schedule. Productivity of workers has gone up 7 or 8-fold, depending on which country you look at. But in terms of working hours, we certainly aren't anywhere near the 15-hour work week that Keynes had forecast. Part of that is that jobs are lumpy. It's hard to pass off work from one person to another in areas where you keep a lot of the stuff in your head. So, think about lawyers who have a whole lot of connections with different clients. It's difficult for them to work part-time. Partly too, we've discovered that the people's desire for additional goods has gone up as incomes have risen. And in some cases, that's a choice. In others, it's a necessity. A 15-hour-a-week job would struggle to pay the mortgage in any major city in Australia. So we need to be a little smarter about how we ensure that those benefits of productivity are shared and to ensure that we're creating the opportunities for good part-time jobs. Claudia Golden, the Harvard economist, a couple of years ago drew a distinction between law and pharmacy. Pharmacy is an occupation where they've become surprisingly good at helping workers hand off to the next person on the shift. Things are kept on the computer, handover is seamless, one part-time pharmacist steps out, the next one steps in and the clients get the same service. Law's been terrible at this. And that's why there are many more part-time pharmacists, and pharmacy has a very small gender pay gap, and very few part-time lawyers, and law has quite a big gender pay gap. So these things are about gender equity as well as about ensuring the quality of work and life.
Yes, well, you're singing my song. As you know, I've been long advocating for a gradual move to a reduction in the standard full-time working week. We've seen some countries in Europe and other places experiment with moving to effectively a 32 or 35-hour week over time. It's often bemused me that the country that led the push for the 8-hour day seems to have taken its foot off the gas in this regard. So something I'll be looking forward to discussing with you again in future.
Are there other reforms that you think I've missed there, Emma, that might make a difference?
I think that for me and the work that I've done over the last few years on gender equality, on the gender pay gap, and understanding not just the pay gap as it exists in a popular imagination between average full-time earnings for men and women, but the lifetime earnings gap for women, which is more like 33% below men because of part-time work, because of taking time out of the workforce for care responsibilities. To me, there's no silver bullet to these issues, but the most effective reform, I think, would be to reduce standard working hours, to, as you say, create more stable part-time opportunities for people in professions, and that will allow then men or partners in relationships to more equally share unpaid work at home. I think, you know, these issues often result in people calling for a universal basic income or for some kind of recognition of paying care work. And I think that there's an absolutely imperative need for us to lift the rate of social security payments in our country and ensure that we're not punishing people who either can't work for whatever reason or there are no jobs for them. But at the same time, I've often said, I don't need someone to pay me to care for my child, but I just want my partner to have the opportunity to do as much care for my child and us both to have equal opportunity to work outside the home. And that, to me, I think is the holy grail of that kind of reform.
There is that European idea of daddy months, yes, where a certain proportion of parental leave is set aside for each parent. And I think it's Sweden that's now moving to full equity there. So you have parental leave on a use it or lose it basis for each parent. Yeah. We've got our daddy fortnight, but my sense is that we could probably push a little bit more on that, and that might help. It might turn out to be habit forming. Yes. The blokes I know who've taken the most time off to spend with newborns are those who tend to then have better work-life balance later on.
And happier families too. And I think
yes,
a lot of evidence coming from those Nordic countries that use it or lose it provision and the requirement for both parents to be equally involved in the early stages of a child's life does have knock-on effects throughout the life.
Yes.
So I think, you know, looking at parental leave arrangements and also childcare arrangements, as well as how we structure the workplace, and as you've alluded to, how we can harness technology to liberate us rather than to ensnare us more, is really important. But there are so many questions in the Q&A, Andrew, so I'm gonna start with some of those. The first one, which I will honour for being so quick off the mark, is from Philip Marchioni, and he says, would a substantial injection of funds, both private and public funds, into affordable and community housing be a worthwhile Labor government initiative?
Absolutely, Philip. And indeed, what we've said through the Housing Australia Future Fund is that it is possible now to invest in social housing and pay a community dividend. So this is an announcement that Anthony Albanese made in his budget reply, along with Jason Clare, who's our Shadow Housing Minister. And the careful work that has been done on that recognises that at a time with historically low interest rates, it makes a lot of sense to have a fund which is in borrowing to invest and then putting the proceeds of that investment, whether that's in infrastructure or equities, back into building more social and affordable housing. We want to make sure that there's more supply in housing. Obviously, the housing issues are complicated, and they do have to do with demand and the increasing tendency over the last couple of months to investors again begin crowding out first home buyers. And the macroprudential measures that APRA has put in place there, they'll make some difference. But it's also a big issue of supply. And that goes to questions of zoning, but also questions of the sheer number of units that are available. And the Commonwealth has an important role to play there. And again, in doing that, Emma, we're following in the footsteps of the Curtin and Chifley governments that came out of the end of World War II saying Australia could do with a whole lot more homes. And in 7 years, boosted the home ownership rate 10 percentage points. Mm-hmm. Just remarkable.
It was a remarkable investment and such a key part of that reconstruction program, which wasn't just about full employment was at the centre of it, but there was a recognition that without secure housing, very little else could flow from that. And of course, that was a great Labor government initiative. Over the last 30, 40 years, though, 30 years even, we've seen the share of social housing in our market fall from, it was around about 12.5% of new builds in the early 90s. It's around about 2% today. So the Labor initiative to have the social housing fund there and the opportunity to work with others in this space would seem to me to be really important. You're not going to make up that 10% drop in one term of, although Chifley did it in 7 years, maybe we can do it. But one of the issues that we're looking at this issue very closely at Per Capita, the wicked problem of housing affordability, and trying to focus in on some new solutions. Affordable housing, not social housing, but private rental or build or rent to buy properties for key workers in cities is becoming a really big issue in terms of, and the implications on that for our social cohesion. Do you see a role for industry super or big super funds to play an investment role there or a provider role in some of those medium affordable housing markets?
Absolutely, Emma. And one of the measures that's more common overseas is the so-called build to rent. If you're in Manhattan, there are entire buildings which are owned by a single entity, and then apartments are rented out. And that means that the owner is able to take care of all of those maintenance issues, and you don't get some of the complexities that can arise when different people own all the different apartments. Build to rent's not going to be for everyone, but it should be an option which is more commonly deployed in Australia. And then, that issue for essential workers is absolutely critical. I mean, that 20% house price appreciation on average over the last 12 months, you look at the typical big city, that meant that they saw house prices going up by some $700 a day. This is for people who are earning, $1,000 a week. The idea that you've got house price appreciation of $700 a day, it just means that homes are increasingly stretching further out of reach. And it means that you've got an economy where homes are earning more than jobs, where property ownership is paying huge dividends through rent and capital gains, but where workers are seeing real wages going backwards. And that's not a situation that's sustainable for Australia.
No, it's not. We don't want to be a country where an AMBO or a nurse or a teacher can't afford to buy a house within an easy commute of their work. It will actually have huge implications for us. So we are doing quite a lot of work on this issue at Per Capita, and we look forward to talking to you about it in more detail. We must move on to some other issues, though. You talked a lot about education and the need for a vibrant education sector and an offering that meets people's needs as being key to a more ambitious Australia. Australia, my friend and co-editor from the book that you contributed to last year, What Happens Next, Janet McColman's with us today, and I'm going to read out Janet's question, which is about education, a key concern of hers and of mine. Angela Rayner in the UK, who's the Shadow Education Minister over there, proposed a national education service like the National Health Service that serves you from birth to old age as a fundamental entitlement. Expensive at first, long-term investment in skills, happiness and social trust, off the charts, she would suggest. What do you think of that idea?
Janet, I would expect nothing more than a big, bold idea from you, kind of following that fabulous book that you and Emma produced. And I think you did really take the measure of the community at that point. People looking for exciting ideas and for a build back, which is more than simply back to 2019. I think Britain's doing a lot of interesting things in the education space. I think the Education Endowment Foundation is bringing a lot of evidence to bear on questions where previously we just had ideology. I'm a huge fan of randomised trials, and the randomised trials that they're doing on everything from school breakfast programs to how best to teach drama is improving the feedback loop for new initiatives in school education. I think the issues that span the spectrum are perhaps bigger than a single entity can take charge of, but that doesn't mean that we don't need better joining up and across certain permutations. Now, I think especially of joining up vocational training and universities. So in the US, there's this notion of a 2-year and a 4-year college, and that implies that if you go to 2-year college, you'll be able to take some of those credits onto your 4-year college. Likewise, there are people at university that might want to pick up computing skills, for example, learning a particular programming language, which is taught at a nearby TAFE or vocational education centre. And right now, that's pretty hard to do. Sometimes these places are incredibly close to one another. My friend and colleague Jim Chalmers talks about the example of Logan with the proximity of Logan TAFE to Logan's Griffith University campus. You can literally throw a rock from one to the other. But as Jim points out, there's much less engagement between the two than there should be. I think that's a terrific example of how we could do better to connect the system to make sure that somebody who starts vocational training can go on to higher education if they want to, and also that universities are drawing on the best that's being done right now in vocational training.
Great answer. And so much, I think, we've seen so much loss from our vocational training and from our apprenticeship system over recent years that actually just beginning to restore what's been lost, but recognising, again, as Curtin and Chifley did, that access to education was key to building security and a secure middle class society. So it'll be a big focus, I hope, of an incoming Labor government. You can count on Janet and I to keep the pressure on. Someone else in the questions here that has got a good question, I think, Andrew, that you'll be able to answer for us. Richard Dowling asks, Labor has recently announced a series of policy measures to increase Made in Australia, including leveraging government procurement policy, something again at Per Capita we've been pushing for some time. Is this just old style protectionism under a different brand? Asked Richard.
Richard, I love the provocative question. Thank you very much for throwing that at me. No, we're a proudly internationalist party. We've always been committed to the benefits that Australia gets from trade, migration and foreign investment. But we don't want a playing field which is tilted against Australian firms. Sometimes government procurement is done at the wrong scale. Jobs that could be done by small business end up being lumped together because it's easier for the federal agency that's doing the procuring just to sign one contract rather than to sign 10. But when you have these massive contracts, you can end up crowding out local businesses in favour of overseas business. So we need to make sure that we're not engaging in anything that systematically disadvantages a set of businesses, and that means breaking down contracts to a bite size. We're also part of that proposal which was very carefully crafted by Ed Husick. I should, big shout out to Ed working alongside Anthony there, was to look at procurement and the issue of companies that are headquartered in tax havens or who haven't been paying their tax. And I don't think Australians want government procurement to be going to companies that are getting an edge over their competitors because they're located in the Bahamas or the Caymans. We've just had a big OECD deal on tax havens over the weekend. Hopefully that will translate into legislation here. But one of the impetuses behind that was making sure that tax havens were no longer bleeding the global tax system dry. So we need to take into account in procurement where the firms are located in tax havens.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Jenny Vakari has asked a question that relates to another from my friend Abel Rizvi, which talks about wages in the care economy. I know Labor's been paying careful attention to this. I'm going to read Abel's question because Jenny's fits within it. Wages in the caring industries are dominated by female workers and they're amongst the lowest paid across our economy, as I've demonstrated several times. As our population ages, the caring industries will face the biggest demand for more workers. And this, I know aligns with Abel's own area of expertise, which is immigration. And some work that I put out a year ago, the Case for a Care-Led Recovery, showed that early childhood education and aged care actually rely on migrant workforces about twice as much as most other sectors. So while workers in this industry are exceedingly overworked due to poor staff-client ratios, particularly in the aged care sector, as we saw through the Royal Commission, what can be done to improve the wages of workers in these industries, in these feminised industries that, as I have shown time and again, are undervalued because they perform reproductive labour? What's Labor's view on that?
Yes, reproductive labour is a really good way of putting it, Emma. And I think Jenny and Abel's point there goes to how we value what we now call essential workers. One of the real ironies of the last year and a half has been that those who are essential workers have in many cases been exposed to much greater dangers than to inessential workers. So your typical advertising executive earns a whole lot more than somebody who is responsible for stacking shelves at Coles. But the Coles worker is an essential worker. Advertising executives, love them as though we do, are not essential workers. And those in the caring economy, particularly those in aged care, are essential workers and need to be respected as such. One of the reasons that COVID spread through the aged care sector here and else in other countries was the fact that too many aged care workers couldn't make ends meet with a job at one aged care centre, and so they were working at multiple centres. Yeah. And when they picked up COVID, they then carried it across from one centre to another. That's not their fault. That's the fault of the institutions that saw them having to work multiple part-time jobs. So greater respect for aged care workers, better funding for that sector, which has been chronically underfunded, as my colleague Julie Collins previously and now Claire O'Neill have rigorously pointed out. When you have a Royal Commission into Aged Care whose interim report is simply titled Neglect, you know that there's a lot that needs to be done. And this is about looking after those in aged care, but also respecting those who work in aged care. Since you mentioned Abel, I should also give a plug for his terrific new book, Population Shock. Abel and I had a chat for my podcast the other day, and it's a riveting read from somebody who understands our migration system better than almost anyone else in the country.
Seconded. I finished it the other day. It's a terrific read, and having worked with Abel during my time in Parliament, I know him to be one of the most, working in Parliament as an advisor, I know him to be one of the most thoughtful people on these issues, and I'm going to chase you up, Abel, to have a conversation with us and the per capita audience about your book very soon. Andrew, Eva Cox is with us today, of course. Eva attends so many of our events, and I'm always chuffed because I grew up learning so much from Eva. She's asked, what about the privatisation of community services? And this goes back to the point you made about trust in government and how important that is, particularly on the Labor side. She says, trust involves being included in policies and you ignore ignore all of the non-employed, and I think this is shorthand for people providing unpaid care and care work, and also those that can't find paid work. Fairness comes with a social contract. I love it when Eva brings up the social contract. And that's what makes government trustworthy. So I think the question there is, what's Labor's view of the increased outsourcing of not only public service work within the advisory function of the Australian Public Service in Canberra, but more and more outsourcing of community sector work as well? And this goes back to my views of the foundational economy, as you know.
Yes, and like you, I've learned a great deal from Eva, who is really an extraordinary pillar of the Australian public policy conversation. We've seen a shift in attitudes towards privatisation. I noted a couple of years back, Rod Sims, the head of the competition watchdog, said that his own views had shifted as increasingly he'd seen firms take over in industries which were really operating as natural monopolies and gouge the consumer in a way in which their previously government-owned entities hadn't done. So there's always a risk if we sell off an asset that occupies a strong market position, that the price ends up being paid by the citizens in higher costs, rather than making sure that we keep the entity in government hands. And in the case of the care economy, I think there is a lot to be said for the public services providing really high quality services there. We can see through, for example, early childhood education, the fragmented nature of the system compared to other countries where you have much more standardisation of early childhood. There's lots that we might look to improve about school, but there is something pretty straightforward about everyone having a local institution in their neighbourhood which is paid for by their taxes, and compared to the way in which early childhood supports have worked, it's much cleaner and much more straightforward. Early childhood can really suffer from the way in which the subsidies chop and change, and from the variation in the quality that you see across the sector. Many centres are fabulous, some are not, and often it's pretty hard to choose.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. A question now really that I think is pertinent at the moment, given the conversation we're having about integrity in Parliament. And this one comes from Amilaja. I apologise if I'm mispronouncing your name. Amilaja Thompson. Hi, Andrew. Will Labor address the quality of legislation going through Parliament, which seems to have little relevance to the greater good? How additionally would Labor address the issue of transparency and the various gaps and loopholes that currently seem to exist to benefit a select few?
Elijah, it's a broad question there, and thank you for being so careful in terms of how you think about legislation. It is really important that we're there ensuring that legislation doesn't have loopholes in it. In the area of tax, which is one of my passions that I've resisted foisting on you today, I do think of this as often being a contest between highly paid corporate accountants who are constantly looking for loopholes and the tax office and Treasury who are looking to close those loopholes and shore up the revenue base. So we need to make sure that we've got the very best advice going into drafting these laws. Good parliamentary scrutiny can make a difference. I'm Deputy Chair and now the Acting Chair of the House Economics Committee, and we have looked to scrutinise government wherever we can to make sure that these loopholes are closed down. If we're able to land this OECD deal, I think that will be pretty important. So the in-principle agreement was on the weekend, but then there'll be a full treaty coming into place next year. And if that goes ahead, then they're talking about some $150 billion from each of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 goes to more revenue being delivered to countries where the sales of digital products occur. Pillar 2 puts in place a 15% global minimum corporate tax rate, which avoids that race to the bottom and the use of tax havens. There's questions over the phase-in and the timetable, but these are important reforms, and they're going to require everyone's eyes to be on the detail as they hit the Parliament.
They certainly are, and something we'll keep a close eye on too. As in previous years, the evidence-based policy project, which Per Capita and the Institute for Public Affairs do, will be out in November, where we look at different policies over the last year and try to evaluate how well they've followed an objective process. Always an interesting exercise, so look out for that one. A great question here, which I know goes to an interest of yours, Andrew, from our friend Fran Bohm. Would Labor evaluate the performance of privatised services? She includes in the NDIS, in schools and so on, and certainly public versus private schools, and that results in what many people feel is a two-tiered education system. The issue, though, that struck me there is Labor's and your approach to how we evaluate the impact of government services and government programs, and also those that have been outsourced.
Thanks so much, Fran. I'm a randomister, as you know, and somebody who passionately believes that the approach that we use to test new pharmaceuticals could be usefully deployed to improve the quality of government services. Labor took to the last election the policy of an evaluator general located in Treasury, and Jim Chalmers has emphasised our enthusiasm for that policy and for making sure that we have higher quality feedback loop for what government does. We know that not every idea that sounds good actually turns out to work in practice. There's very good evidence in a range of areas coming from randomised trials. So I'd be supportive of doing that, and that may well go to different models for service delivery. I think about some of the ideas such as Scared Straight or the 21st Century Academies, all sounded terrific, but turned out not to produce the hoped for results. And in the area of privatised services, we need to make sure that taxpayers are getting proper value for money and good evaluation as turns on that. I'm part of something called the Global Commission on Evidence, which is an international commission that'll be bringing down a report at the end of this year, looking at use of evidence across particularly governments, but also non-government organisations in the private sector. And that is very much grounded in the belief that when we use evidence well, we can far better serve our constituents.
Thanks, Andrew. I've got about 5 or 10 minutes to go, so just a couple of other questions from the feed. We've had quite a few about universities and the impact on universities of this pandemic, and particularly on them being cut out effectively of JobKeeper. We know that universities have lost about 40,000 employees over the last 18 months, possibly more. And as one of our questioners says, he's anonymous, so I can't recognise him by name, that on top of the previous casualisation in that sector, it's become quite a crisis. Insecure work is wiping out the skill base of one of Australia's biggest export industries, but not only that, reducing our capacity to invest in the future knowledge base of our nation, and what implications that has for our ability to innovate and to be more productive. What's Labor's view of what could be done about the workforce crisis in our university sector?
Emma, the situation in universities really is dire. You talk about organisations being decimated. Well, the Australian National University has literally been decimated. More than 1 in 10 staff have gone. And that's happened because during the pandemic, public universities were denied access to JobKeeper. Not all universities were carved out. Bond University got JobKeeper. New York University Sydney campus got JobKeeper. But a program which should have been available to the university sector if they met the criteria wasn't extended, and that's had huge costs. We had a hookup of the Labor Education Caucus Labor Caucus Education Committee with the National Tertiary Education Union this morning, and they were going through the horrendous figures on job losses and how that's gone initially from the loss of casual jobs, now to the loss of many permanent jobs. Here in some institutions, they're losing agriculture programs, technology programs, the engineering programs, even neuroscience was on the chopping block at one stage at the ANU. And that means that at a time when we should be encouraging Australians to take on higher education, improving their skills, in being able to deal with automation, we're turning people away. So job-ready graduates raises the cost of higher education for many people, particularly those who want to study in areas like the humanities and social sciences, which we know produce good long-term wage returns, and of course are just fundamental to us being a prosperous, productive and thoughtful community.
Thank you. You said earlier that you hadn't inflicted your views on tax upon us today, but several of our commentators and myself would like you to inflict some of those views before we finish up. So I'm just going to take a few of the questions that are more about economics that I've saved up until the end. The first one I think is interesting given recent talk, both here and internationally, about the role of our Reserve Bank and Labor's commitment that they're not opposed to a review of the Reserve Bank. So what, if anything, would you change if there was to be a review in the Reserve Bank Act? What would you change in the statement on the conduct of monetary policy?
Wow. Well, I think one of the points here, Emma, is you don't want to have a review if you've predetermined the outcome. So getting a root and branch review of the Reserve Bank just makes sense because you need fresh eyes. And I was a bit surprised, actually, when I asked Phil Lowe about this at a recent RBA hearing that he didn't immediately embrace it, because I think it would be good for the institution. It's an institution that is traditionally promoted from within and whose governing board contains mostly talented generalists rather than monetary policy experts. It doesn't hold press conferences when it announces its decision and doesn't publish the voting decisions at RBA board meetings. So that could help as well. On your question about the statement on the conduct of monetary policy, we do know that one of the things that followed the last set of changes to that statement by the coalition was too much of a focus by the Reserve Bank on house prices. Now, I share the broad concern about house price appreciation, but you can't target two different things with one instrument. It's what economists call the Tinbergen rule. So if we're asking the Reserve Bank to be delivering full employment, we can't also be asking them to tamp down house prices. And I think there was a period where they took their eye off the ball, allowed rates to stay too high for too long, and therefore didn't deliver us an economy with as many jobs as could have been the case if they'd been focused on full employment.
Well, as you know, Labor's commitment to produce a white paper on full employment after the next election was music to our ears at Per Capita, something we've been pushing for a long time. So terrific to see that focus, the party of the working people. One or two final questions about tax. So coming from David Balcom in the chat, this was a question posed early on, but I've saved it for the end. He says he agrees with your priorities for a more ambitious Australia 100%, but how can the deliberately arranged structural budget deficit, lowering tax on the wealthy, high income earners, I think, corporate tax reductions, and a failure to reverse tax benefits to the wealthy, such as super tax concessions and so on, be dealt with to provide the funds to do the great things you propose? This is a challenge, isn't it, for an incoming government? We've got a big deficit. We have baked in big tax cuts. Nobody wants to go to an election arguing about tax. I understand that, but we do have a challenge, don't we, in meeting our obligations in the future if we don't address some of those revenue shortfalls.
Absolutely, Emma. And David's spot on to be asking this important question. We will have an ambitious plan around multinational taxation. You can expect that Labor will do more in that area and lead the debate as we traditionally have. We also need to make sure we're looking at the spending side. There's some $20 billion in slush funds that Katie Gallagher has identified. The rorts that have gone on with ministerial discretion rather than careful cost-benefit analysis deciding funding has been outrageous. So there's careful measures that can be put in place in order to ensure that we're not spending taxpayer dollars in areas that aren't producing an economic return, that are only producing a political return for the coalition. But David's question also goes to the character of the next election campaign. We know we're up against a Prime Minister who isn't particularly ambitious for Australia, but is very ambitious for himself, and who won the last election based in large part on pretending that tax rises for a small number of people would be tax rises for a large number of people. And so we'll be taking a tighter set of policies to the next election because we want to have that conversation around jobs, health and education, not be copying scare campaigns from the master of the scare campaign.
I noticed and said rather cheekily on social media the other day that the Prime Minister cited Tim Wilson's success with his death tax scare and retiree tax scare as a key reason for promoting him to this outer ministry. And I think that says everything about this government's approach to truth and to integrity in policy. I'm going to finish up with this fantastic final question, which has come from Colin Sindel. Early last year, I think middle of last year, noting all the things you've talked about today, Andrew, such as social capital and trust, non-market labour, which are not captured by GDP. I didn't write this question myself, I promise. Jim Chalmers suggested that we could look at a version of New Zealand's wellbeing budget, which redefines what success means in terms of our economic outcomes. And of course, he was mocked by the current treasurer, who accused him of, in quite racist way, actually, wanting to sing kumbaya in the parliament. But what is your view of the New Zealand model? And how do you think, as I've often talked about, we can incorporate into our measures of success? I'm not advocating for junking the GDP, that would be crazy, right? But how can we build on our measures to take account more of the things that matter to us and of our well-being?
And Colin, great question to finish on. Anyone who's taken a first-year economics class will know that economics isn't about maximising money, it's about maximising well-being or utility or happiness. We need to ensure that the Treasury is focused on the same goal. Oddly enough, at the very same time that Josh Frydenberg was attacking Jim Chalmers for talking about wellbeing budgeting, his very own Treasury has a formal statement that it's committed to wellbeing budgeting, but in practice it has sometimes been too quick to prioritise measures such as GDP. We talk often in Australia about the aggregate number of GDP. We adjust it for inflation, but we don't adjust it for population, which means that we're effectively patting ourselves on the back for the growing size of the pie, even if that is being fuelled by a larger number of people. I'm a big supporter of immigration, but what people care most about is their own living standards. So a measure such as real net national disposable income per capita would be a better measure to focus on when we're talking about budgets. And the New Zealanders have also brought in things like child poverty. They've made that a central target for the government. It is hard to reduce the child poverty rate. Bob Hawke taught us that with his pledge to eliminate child poverty in 1990. But that doesn't mean this isn't an important goal. There is too much child poverty in Australia, and making the reduction of child poverty a focus would be an important change as well. Full employment, reducing child poverty, ensuring we're having less impact on the planet. And then, as you say, Emma, absolutely, GDP as well. All of these should be part of what corporate Australia would call a balanced scorecard. Emma, since it's the last question you're asking me, thank you very much for hosting this. Per Capita makes its mark on the Australian public landscape and continues to do so with all of the papers and ideas you churn out. So it's a real honour to be part of the conversation with you and with your terrific supporters today.
Thank you, Andrea. Conversations with you always go by so quickly that I'm always shocked when we're coming to the end of our time together. But it was a terrific chat. And as you noted, we will continue to put out papers in this space. We're actually, one of our longer term projects is trying to develop an inequality index for Australia to look at those aspects that what do we need to address to have a focus on wellbeing. It's terrific for all of us and our audience to know there are people in our parliament as thoughtful about these issues and as informed about them, who think about policy in such an interconnected way as you do. So thank you again for joining us and giving us your time today. Thank you all of you for joining us at this webinar. We have another coming up on Friday week, again with one of our members of our federal opposition, Peter Khalil, who's the MP for Wills here in Melbourne, and he'll be talking about COP26 in Glasgow, Australian diplomacy and Labor's alternative vision. So please join us for that on Friday the 22nd. And at our upcoming webinars, we have Fiona McLeod and others from the In the National Interest series. Abel, I will be after you for one as well. But again, thank you, Andrew, and thank you all of you for joining us here today.
Thanks, Emma. Bye now.
Bye-bye.